Welcome back to I'm a Software Engineer, What Next podcast. Season 1 is now done and behind us, and this is us kicking off Season 2 a little bit differently, taking inspiration from last year's summer shorts. Quicker, looser episodes, just Matt and I in between our usual guests. Season 1 was all about you, the software engineer, and what's next. That's not changing, but this season we're also going to pick a current topic each week, something that's probably on a lot of engineers' minds, and talk it through for 20 minutes or so. Today is a good place to start, very topical right now, that management is a one-way door. I want to get into it because I'm not sure it's actually true, but it's definitely a trend. Matt, welcome back. Thanks for joining us again.
Thanks for inviting me back. You know, they said it'd never last, but here we are. What next for the What Next podcast? Yes, I think this is a really interesting question, both personally and I think from an industry point of view. Let's start out. What do you mean? What does one-way door mean? Management is a one-way door. It's a strong statement. How do you want me to interpret that?
That's a good point. I think there's a couple of things, a couple of ways I interpret that. One is a lot of people see management as a one-way door. You go through it and you never come back. At the moment, I see management as a one-way door back. Like, no one really wants to go into management, and people want to come back to becoming an IC again. And I think there's different reasons for that, but essentially, there's different meanings, and I think that's changing. But they're the two sort of
So there's a bunch of people. There's a bunch of people worried about ICs, worried about going through the management one-way door because they fear they can't come back. And there's arguably a bunch of folks on the other side of the one-way door, having gone to management at some point in their career, now banging on the one-way door, trying to get back in. To the IC world.
Or if they go through that door, like, do they become obsolete? And that's it.
Yep.
Which is not necessarily true, but that's what we are seeing. Obviously, a lot of companies that are not needing as many managers at the moment.
Yeah, well, and we were speaking in the prep. There's some crazy numbers about span of control, and span of control is the idea of how many folks you have underneath you when you're in a management or leadership position. And back in the day when I did my MBA many years ago, this sort of the span of control that you would look for would be something like 7 to 12 would be considered a big span of control. Right? These days, I think we mentioned earlier there that we've seen someone like Facebook who already has a large span of control of something like 20, aiming for something like 50 now. Which is super interesting. And so I think we spoke back in Season 1 about this idea of the change to the way the organizational hierarchy works. So traditionally it's a pyramid. You've got a load of folks on the bottom, like juniors and ICs, and then you've got a kind of middle management layer, and then you've got the leadership layer at the top. And one of the things that I predicted might happen with some of the changes that were coming through from AI and from a bunch of other reasons was that rather than sort of killing off the bottom layer, actually what we might end up doing is killing off the middle layer. So we go from, instead of a triangle, we end up with sort of an hourglass type shape, which I think we've seen, right? I mean, we've seen vast numbers of middle management cut from tech businesses and consulting businesses, certainly in London and I know around the world. And so not only is the fear that some of the folks looking at that one-way door potentially valid about losing their skills, it's also potentially a one-way door to a very short plank with nothing on the other side of it. And so, the idea that now ICs are getting paid as much as managers, it's almost self-evidently true because there's many managers who don't have jobs.
Yeah.
Or ex-managers who don't have jobs.
Do you think that also, and this is probably more relevant to the UK because I think it's been a thing in the US, but a lot of ICs now can earn more than a manager. So you wouldn't necessarily go into a management role now to earn more money. You would go in there because you want to earn it. And a lot of people probably went down that path of management because they wanted to earn more money. And now they're like, well, actually, my job's at risk and I can earn more money going back to doing what I actually enjoyed. For some people probably enjoy the management. Do you think that a lot of people are now thinking, well, I could stay in this role and earn good money? Or do you think they're more worried about the fact that if they go into management, they become obsolete?
Look, I think both those things are true. The problem with not the problem, the simple fact of the matter is that, there's folks, the average salary, I remember reading the other day, the average salary at Anthropic is $750,000 now, which tells you, obviously the mean and the median are very, potentially very different, but it tells you what's going on there if that's the average salary.
Starting salary for a junior engineer is about £240,000 in the UK. So it's
at Anthropic.
Yeah. So I think that's the lowest salary for a software engineer.
Yeah,
Plus
which is crazy.
all the other stuff on top of that.
Yeah, which is crazy, right? So you've got that, but the simple fact of the matter is there's going to be a lot fewer of them, right? So just coming out of university with a software engineering degree, you're not going to walk into Anthropic and get 250 grand. So those entry level jobs are for a very small number of people, right? So yes, the average might be going up, but there's fewer people that are clipping the ticket at that rate. Let me try and come back with 3 points, because I think we sort of understand the premise, and I think it's broadly true with a couple of exceptions. So I'm not sure the door was ever one way, but what has changed is the cost of readmission. Okay, so traditionally, if you're away, and in your original LinkedIn post, one of our previous guests, Dan, posted a link to Charity Major's post called Engineering Management, the Pendulum or the Ladder, which we'll leave a link in the show notes. It's a great post. And she talks in that post about the idea of decay, skill decay. And so if you went into management, if you're in management for 3 to 5 years, you probably left the leading edge of tech and would struggle to come back and be productive as certainly as a senior engineer or a principal engineer, potentially, because your skills are decayed. And so in this sort of pre-agentic era, that clock was ticking on how, right? So if you're away from doing it for a long time, your skills decaying and you're losing the ability to know sort of how to do it. I wonder if that hasn't changed a little bit in our modern setup here, so that the way back's actually a bit easier, because we have this situation now where, and I'm gonna put some riders on this. Let's say that you're a very good engineer before you went into management, and so you understand the fundamentals, you put stuff into production, you know the human factors of building software, all of these things that are sort of eternal with software, right? And you still have those skills because they're kind of eternally useful skills. A lot of the how now has been, the cost of how is coming down, not quite zero, but it's approaching zero. Because, well, what I do these days is, instead of having to type out all the code, I can kind of express my preference to the machine and then work with the machine, and the machine does the how. What I have to worry about is the why and the what. Now, traditionally, management and leadership was a lot more about why and what than it was about how. So there may be an argument that those of us who made that transition and were reasonably good engineers will be able to drop back into IC roles and be productive, because the things that are now valuable are actually the why and the what of software engineering, not so much the how. I mean, like I said, there's a bunch of writers around that and foot guns here and there, and see my post on mech suits and so on from a while back, but I think there is maybe an argument, if not necessarily a lay down there, but there's an argument there that maybe it is actually a bit easier to come back, because if you do have those why and what skills and you were a reasonably good engineer, the things that have always been true about software engineering, the things that have always been hard, right? Working out what to do, working out the people factors, those things are still value. You still have those valuable skills, and they can be deployed now, except with one difference, is you're sort of using agents to do it. And then the second point is, sort of to again, maybe just a slight pushback on Charity's point, but the thing that decays, I think, isn't so much your skill, but your credibility. Okay, so your skills definitely drop off a little bit, but I think people that they discount to time things that you've done recently much less than they discount things you did in the past. Okay, so if you built built some app in the teens, and then you built an app in the aughts, and then you built an app in the 20s, right? The architecture of those things, in many ways, or certainly the processes you use to go and build those software, has changed pretty substantially. Certainly the number of people you need, the infrastructure you use, the way you go about doing software engineering has changed dramatically. So you would tend to discount something from 20 years ago much higher than you would discount something from a couple of years ago. All right. So that's the third one. And then the last one, which is one that I will keep coming back to because it's just a kind of a bugbear of mine, is that the risk isn't that I can't code anymore. The risk is actually now that I can produce anything that I want, but I just can't tell what's good. Right. And so I can have 10 agents running at once, and they can be producing thousands of lines of code, but it's very difficult if I don't have taste to be able to work out what of that code is worth keeping and what's worth throwing away.
As in, it's difficult for someone who doesn't know what they're talking about, or it's difficult because there's so much?
Both, right? So if you don't know what you're talking about, you've lost already, right? If you do know what you're talking about, your problem is, how do I select what's good and bad from this massive amounts of potential crap?
Yep. Okay.
My three pushbacks, and then I'll let you respond to that, and then I've got to okay, so what? That's the so what of those 3 points, but I'll let you respond to those three first.
On your last point, there's this idea of a super IC.
Yep.
Where they one senior or principal engineer or whatever you want to call them, plus a load of AI agents, which is obviously building this code or products, can now do what a whole team could once do. Do you think that that is valid and is now the case, or can be done effectively? And how does that scale? Does it fall apart? Or does it mean that now we can have a lot less engineers? We just have these super ICs that can sort of handle a whole product to themselves, or is that just way too much for one engineer?
Yeah. So here I have a gap in my data here. Okay. So I built 25 odd businesses at BCG Digital Ventures. I had a team of, I think, 30 at peak, and was part of a bigger organization that had about 300 people in the engineering business and nearly 1,000 all up across all of the cohorts. I know how to build and ship systems in the sort of pre-agentic era using the best designers and engineers and product managers and growth hackers and so on, right? So I know how to do that. I then have had the last couple of years building my own stuff, doing my own thing. And so in this sort of pathway about what next we're talking about, I went from being VP of engineering to being so
you've done this very thing. Yeah, super IC.
Let's leave the super out of it potentially, but certainly an IC with a lot of responsibility. Okay. And so what I know I've been able to do in the last, say, from September last year to now, which is the project I'm working on at the moment, I've done what I know would have taken a team of 3 to 4 engineers, 2 designers, a product manager, and maybe some sort of leadership oversight, right? So 5 or 6 people, right? And there's still a bunch of questions about whether or not there's any value in what I've created, and ultimately that'll happen once this thing's released. But just in terms of the output and the quality level of the output, it's roughly at the level that it would have been under those previous circumstances. So that's pretty interesting, right? So if it's a commercial failure, it's a different problem. But the product engineering side of it, I have proved to myself and anyone who looks at it, they go, oh wow, there's a lot here, right? And so for me, I've made that point. Like as a VP leader, I've gone back to being a super IC, let's call it, right? And I've been enormously productive. Probably to the point of burnout, but that's another story, right? Now, the question I have is, what's the scale up unit from? What's the difference between what we used to have a team of, say, 5 to 10 to build and launch a B2B SaaS product or a commercial product? We used to have a team of 5 to 10 to do the 0 to 1 part of it, right? And that's full. That's shoot and box and die, right? The whole lot, right? Engineers, product managers, and so on. And then the sort of single person startup or 2-person startup, there's me and a CEO, and the CEO is exclusively looking after funding, and I'm doing all the product, right? What's the scale up? What's the unit of scale up from where I am to what's next? Do I just go and get another super IC like me and we just split the estate in half, right? Do I go and get 2 juniors and lift up a level maybe and do what, the meta argument that we saw in the press this week about assuming that any management has at least 25% IC kind of mix in their leadership? Right, which would be, I just think back to my BCG days, right? The sort of VP partner level folks having 25% contribution towards actually doing output. It would be hilarious to suggest that was going to be the case, right?
Yeah.
Right, or is it something else? And I actually don't know. I really don't know. So I have a real gap in my my kind of mental model for how this scales. I actually don't know what the next step is. I'm about to find out once we close this funding round, because I do need to make that next scaling. Some bets there, but it's certainly an interesting problem. If you'd have told me that I'd be able to produce the software that I've produced from September last year to now, based on what I had at hand, just off my own pegs, I never would have believed it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, I think a lot's changed in the last 12 months, hasn't it?
Yeah.
I think we could go into this a lot, but one thing I think that it's obviously happening is there is not so much need for junior engineers, so graduate engineers that come out. Where do we put them? Because traditionally, they had a lot of work they could do, whether it be basic coding or whatever. But do you think that's something that we're going to pay for down the track? Like that all of a sudden we're not going to have these people that we need, 5 or 6 years down the track? Or you think we will?
Yeah. So back to the hourglass thing, right? So there's a couple of second order effects of this hourglassing of the workforce. So the first one is that the reason that you go into a corporate, like part of the contract, right? Like obviously there's job security and salary and these kind of things, but part of the contract, the social contract there with large organization is you come in at the bottom, you work alongside folks who know what they're doing, you learn, you get better, and you get promoted. Okay. And then when you get promoted, this sort of, you turn up at the next floor, as it were, and all of a sudden there's a whole bunch of stuff you don't know, which you then work alongside people who do, and you get better at it, and right. And so, and on and on. And then there's a selection process where the best folks, arguably, maybe not the best, necessarily the best, but the best connected, maybe in some cases, right? But by some selection function, folks accrete towards the top, and they become future managers first, and then leaders ultimately. Now, if we're gutting the middle, right? Two things happen. The first thing is that there is nowhere to be promoted into as a junior, right? There just isn't a gap there anymore. Or if there is a gap, it's very small, okay? And not everyone can do it. So the incentive to do the grind and graft that you need to do, particularly in, things like management consulting and financial services, like those early years, those 100-hour weeks, right, of just absolute graft, right? You look at that and you go, hang on, there's 100 of us here at this level, and there's one job above me. Or if you take the Facebook example at 50 span of control, there's 100 people, there's 2 jobs there, right? So 2% of us are going to make it through. Why on earth am I going to do that?
Yeah.
Right. And so that social contract breaks down, and then people go and choose to do something else, which we can come back to, right? The next problem, which is a few years further down the track, is that leaders are selected from the best folks that are doing the management below.
Yeah.
And if they aren't there, then there's no one to select from. And all of a sudden you have this kind of like a decay, almost like a collapse, a management leadership collapse. There won't be the folks to promote into those senior leadership roles. And if this happens across industries, it's not just an internal to a business thing, right? As we well know, often folks move around to get into management positions, right? Like and certainly leadership positions. They're not going to be in other organizations either. All right.
Yeah.
And so then we have this sort of leadership. So the first thing we have is the breakdown of the social contract with the way corporates work. And then the second thing is we have this leadership collapse where we just don't have quality leadership to take over these businesses going forward. Now, the techno optimist will go, AI will do all the work, right? And okay, maybe that's true. Maybe it isn't. It's a big risk, though, because I'm not sure that there's any evidence that it's going to happen. There may be some wishful thinking that it will happen, but I don't know. I'm not sure that it will. That to me, like whenever I talk to anyone about the future of work, those two things are the things that really, really worry me. And actually, there's a third sort of economic-wide side effect of this, which is tax. Now, contrary to what some people have you believe, the vast majority of the tax, the PAY or government taxation revenue, comes from that middle band, right? Folks on low incomes don't earn enough money to pay that much tax. They pay sales tax and so on, but they don't earn enough money to pay tax. And rightly or wrongly, folks at the top earn enough money to not have to pay much tax, right? And they can do things like change their income around and all sorts of stuff, right? So the burden is in the middle. Now, if you take something like, I don't know, let's say the legal profession or software engineering, they're traditionally very highly paid categories of work, right? If you gut those, right, in the way that I imagine we're about to do as a society, then that's a whole bunch of people who used to pay a whole bunch of tax who are not going to be paying that tax anymore.
I had not thought of it like that. That's really interesting.
And so this is a real concern. It's a real concern, right? So then you play that out, right? Well, what on earth do we do if let's just pick a number I don't know what the actual number is, but let's just pick a number. Let's say that 50% of tax revenue comes from those middle bands, and that's big. Ultra conservative and say that we have half as many middle managers as we used to have, right? Then you're taking 25% of the government's tax revenue is gone. And then the question you have to ask is, who is that accruing to? Who does that value accrue to, right? It doesn't accrue to society. It accrues to the shareholders of the remaining businesses that are hoovering up that work that used to be done by the folks in that band, right? And we all know
and
who
not
that
paying
is.
the PAYG type taxes.
Yeah, they're avoiding it. I'm not suggesting it's being avoided.
I'm just saying that goes out of that into a different
Yeah,
category.
exactly.
Yeah.
Instead of PAYE tax being paid by employees at that middle band, those folks no longer exist, and so therefore not paying tax. And the value actually accretes to the organisations that can reorient themselves and work in this new smaller workforce model, hourglass model, where they can have 100 or 50 span of control with intelligent agents doing the work that managers used to do, if that's possible, if that is indeed possible. Now, I prefer that's a dystopian future, but it's also a lot has to be true for that to come to pass.
If you were to that's not at all how I anticipated you were going to answer that question. I thought you were going to give me more of a what's going to happen to the engineer, but that's more society in general, isn't it? Because if we're paying less taxes, knowing what you know now, I don't think it's fair to say if you could go back in time, you would change anything. But if you were starting now, well, I mean, you would change things, but do you know what I mean? Like, because most of your career has been management. So therefore, and it's only now that things are changing rapidly in terms of the IC. But if you were starting out now or early in your career, do you think you would be more inclined to go down that IC path, the super IC path, or would you still think that you really enjoy the management side and that's what you would prefer to pursue? Okay, because there's going to be management. There must be some type of management roles. It just might be a bit different.
Yeah. So let me give you a third answer, because and for the record, of 30 plus years, 10 has been management and leadership here in the UK, about 5 in Australia before that. So it's probably 50-50 from IC to management leadership, right? So and then the last 2 has been I've been writing software just like non-stop for the last sort of 2 years, right? So it's super probably 50-50, on balance, right? But even in the late the Aussie stuff, I was CTO and I was sort of had my hand in, but yeah, whatever. Okay, so remind me again the question so I can just answer it properly.
Well, what would I change? What do you think you would? Yeah, what would you do now? Do you think?
Okay,
because you know what it's like to be in management, so that may not. You may want to. You may prefer that.
Yeah, no. So I can give you a direct answer, right, and an honest, actual answer, like sort of money where my mouth is. At the end of the BCG Digital Ventures BCGX time, I saw the writing on the wall, right? I saw that this isn't the future and I have, we can do this on another podcast, but that kind of knowledge work, which is essentially recycling stuff that experts know into a way that can be consumed by people who don't know it, right? I think that whole business model is under genuine threat, but let's have that have that as a conversation for another day, right? But I saw this writing on the wall and I was really, really well paid. And I realized that there just wasn't going to be a job for me at the level of salary that I had by going and being an employee again. I could see it just plain as day. And there was only one way out. The only way out was to make the job that I wanted to have. Okay, and I was lucky enough, and circumstances allowed it. Hopefully, that's been the case, and so I've been able to manufacture the job that I wanted to do. And what's interesting is I can see. So now let's come down the hierarchy a little bit. I've got 2 kids, 21, 20, and I can see them. The workforce at that level is just awful at the moment. Even for the most basic jobs, it's just impossible to get work. Right, and so I set about giving them a fast lane ticket, right? Not money, right? But a fast lane ticket. I thought the only way to get them on the ladder is to have them build their own little micro business and operate that at a time in their career where the cost of failure is very low.
Yeah.
Right. So they're young. They haven't had a job. If the thing that they're doing fails, then it costs them nothing, but they gain the experience of having done it. And all of a sudden they are now one rung above everyone else because they've been building these little businesses. And so that's what I'm doing. What I'm doing now at 54 is what I'm going to try and do for them at 21 and 20, right? So that they have the job, like no one else is going to give them a job. So we're going to build the thing for them that gives them the job to go into.
Yeah. I think it's great advice to try and do your own thing. The only problem is some people can't sustain that. They need a job and therefore they're not going to have the time to do it. But I guess...
No, but this is my point about cost of failure. So when you're young and you're eating ramen and you're sleeping on a bench, right, in a share house, your costs are low. You don't have mortgage, you don't have children, and so on. And so the cost of failure is very low. Yeah. And so the infrastructure, and I use the word in the broadest sense, the infrastructure you need to start a business is just so readily available.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And so this is my hope. This is my great hope. So maybe not so much for millennials, but the folks below, the next generation now. And so the 21-year-olds and the sort of, let's call them the 15 to 25-year-olds at the moment. I see those folks as super entrepreneurial. And I know this is a bit of a controversial viewpoint. They have this worldview, which is like the social contract is broken down. I don't trust corporates. I don't trust, the government, right? You see this everywhere. So I'm going to do my own thing. Now, what they're often doing is stuff that is maybe a bit socially questionable sometimes, like, oh, I'm gonna sell sneakers on TikTok, right? Or I'm gonna blah blah blah, right? So leave aside the kind of the particular thing that they're doing. The mentality is, oh, hang on, I can just become an influencer, right? And we can argue about whether there's any social value in influencing, but there's no doubt that entrepreneurial mindset is really, really richly being exploited by folks of that generation. So I have a lot of hope, and that's why with my two, I've said, look, all right, the best way to give you guys a job is to build a business that you can go and work in. Now, you don't want to be an influencer or sell sneakers online, right? Whatever. But we can build credible businesses for you, micro businesses for you that take their skills. So one's doing animation, one's doing mechanical engineering. Like we can kind of combine their skills in their uni. We can set up a kind of an internship set up, right, so that they have on their CVs there's credible work that they've done, blah 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 blah, right? And because I fear that social contract, as I mentioned before, that social contract for those folks that age, I think that days are numbered, right? Go to uni, work hard, come in at the bottom end of a business, work hard, get promoted, get superannuation paid, get healthcare paid. I think those days are numbered.
Scary. Things are definitely changing. I think there's a lot of things that we go deeper into there, but we do want to keep it relatively short. So
we might have to do part 2 of this one.
I think there's some themes in here that we could actually explore further. One thing I didn't ask you at the start of this episode, is that a new shirt? Because that was always part of our intro. Fallout.
Yeah, we'll do it as an outro. Yeah, so this is just classic video game. I think Fallout 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 been fantastic games over the years. Although I think 5 was a bit of controversy. I never played 5, but I spent a lot of time playing 4 with my son. A great. Speaking of dystopian futures, it's a great dystopian future game.
That's awesome. Well, thank you for that, Matt. And we're going to leave some notes in the show notes. If you've got topics that people want to explore, feel free to message us. We've got a bunch of ideas coming up, but it will be dependent on what's happening around the place as well. Appreciate anyone who's made it this far again, and we hope to see you again soon. Thanks, Matt.
Indeed. Thanks for your time, James. Talk to you soon.
Bye.